You're listening to the Talking Headways podcast network. This is Talking Headways, a weekly podcast about sustainable transportation and urban design. I'm Jeff Wood. This week we're joined by Adrianna Rizzo of Californians for Electric Rail. We chat about freight and warehousing growth in California's inland empire, the benefits of train electrification and CEQA exemptions, and why headers and trains are getting more attention they may not deserve. Stay with us. Today's podcast is brought to you by our super generous Patreon supporters. Thanks infinitely to all the transit planners, bus drivers, advocates, and friends that support the show. To join this merry gang of zoning misfits and transit lovers, go to patreon.com/theoverheadwire. $2 a month will get you some stickers and a handwritten note. $10 a month will get you one of our transportation scarves. We appreciate everyone's support over the last year and look forward to sharing more episodes in 2024. That's patreon.com/theoverheadwire. Also, if you want to support the show in other ways, check out the show notes in your podcatcher or go to theoverheadwire.com to find links to our Cars Are Cholesterol merch, our Talking Headways book club shop at bookshop.org, or sign up for a 2-week free trial of our 18-year-old daily newsletter and archive. Thanks for supporting, and this year make sure to listen to this space for opportunities for happy hours, live performances, and updated information on coming attractions. Adrianna Rizzo, welcome to the Talking Headways podcast.
Great. Thanks so much for having me on.
Well, thanks for being here. Before we get started, can you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Yeah, so my day job, I'm a PhD student in earth science, study life and evolution and how they all intersect with climate. But I live in Riverside, California, which is in the region of the Inland Empire. It's, sort of working class suburb of Los Angeles, which consistently has the worst air quality in the country, violating EPA standards for ozone for, I think, over half the year. And it's basically a transit desert. We don't have very high quality public transportation. And, I grew up in San Francisco. I've lived in Chicago, lived in places with much better public transit. And so sort of, the connection between all those things has always bothered me. It seemed really obvious. And, as somebody who's kind of engaged with local politics, where the impacts of the logistics industry of warehouses on communities is really at the forefront. I'm seeing all of these things connected, but I felt like there was a kind of missing piece to a lot of this advocacy in terms of understanding how transit and freight and all of these things all fit together. And so that's kind of what motivated me, together with like a coalition of sort of, let's say, housing, transit, environmental activists that I already knew from other things. We all sort of got together to start Californians for Electric Rail, which is a advocacy organization basically advocating for converting all of the rail lines in the state to using overhead electric wires as their power source.
Were you interested in this stuff when you were younger, like when you were a little kid? Not really necessarily. You're not going to be obviously reading laws or anything like that, but like little things like, hey, I like to look at that train or something like that.
Yeah, I've always been like a transit nerd. Like my parents said that when I was like 3 or 4 years old, I had all the bus lines and the city memorized and could always tell you how to get to whatever place based on what bus you would have to take to get there. I also remember I had a friend in the suburbs and we used to ride Caltrain down there, and I used to love taking Caltrain. It was a special treat as a kid. So yeah, I've always been kind of a train buff, I guess, before getting really serious with this policy.
We'll get to Caltrain in a second, but let's chat a little bit about the Inland Empire, though. I kind of want to hear more about that area because I think there's a lot of folks outside of California and perhaps outside of LA who maybe never heard of it.
Yeah, so we're one of the most rapidly growing regions in California, actually, particularly since the pandemic when, a lot of people were leaving the city, wanted a bigger house or what have you. But yeah, I think we're sort of at the forefront of two big national trends. One, which is sort of the suburbanization of poverty due to a lot of different factors, lack of growth in urban centers that has priced a lot of people out, displaced people from Los Angeles and Orange County. They've moved to inland areas where housing's traditionally been more affordable. And then we've also seen kind of the suburbanization of industry as well. In the last decade, really, with the growth of online shopping and international trade, as with, a lot of imports from China, the way that industry has gone is goods are increasingly coming at the Port of Long Beach and they travel, 60 miles inland to where there's more cheap land to these massive warehouses where that stuff is then sorted and processed to get shipped out to fulfill everybody's Amazon orders and delivered to people's homes. Both of those trends have seen a lot of growth. If you're listening nationally, I think, the kind of collar counties in Chicago are very similar type of place, sort of working class parts of Long Island, Queens. I think in New York City, kind of a similar deal in terms of the way these patterns are going. It's a national trend, but I think in Southern California, because we're near the largest port in the country and also the severity of the housing crisis in Los Angeles have really made these trends really clear. And development patterns are also directly responsible for the bad air quality. We have lots and lots of heavy trucks on the highways, sometimes 2-3 lanes that are like solid just trucks on a bad day. Trucks produce a lot more ozone and other pollutants per mile than do cars. But then also, it's a very car dependent area. We've seen a lot of population growth in the past decades, and the transit infrastructure has really not grown to the same degree. I think the Riverside, Ontario, San Bernardino metropolitan area is actually larger than San Francisco. We have combined area of over 1 million people. We have I think the lowest transit mode share of any major city. The VET's over, I want to say it's 97% of people drive alone to work or something like that. And, this combination of this kind of polluting VMT inducing industry and, very car dependent development pattern is really bad news for the air quality. And of course, we also get, air pollution that's blown in from the coastal areas as well because of the geography. You're kind of in this triangle shaped basin, and all of the smog generated by people driving on the coast, we get these ocean breezes that push all the smog eastward where it gets concentrated in these areas.
Yeah, I have family members in Bakersfield, and I think some of that happens there too, where stuff gets pushed into the valley, and there's a lot of agricultural stuff that gets kicked up as well there. But the warehousing and stuff in the Inland Empire has been really growing like weeds. It's just been popping up, and there's been so many news items and articles about it that have been really interesting to see how things are changing and how the farmland is turning into warehouses and that type of thing, which is really fascinating. And from the perspective of the stuff that we're talking about in this podcast, I mean, there's a connection there because of the needs of shipping all the stuff from Long Beach or the Port of LA to those warehouses inland, and they could go up to Bakersfield or they could go up to the Inland Empire. And so there's a need for, electrification of transportation from that too. And they've tried all kinds of different things like overhead wire trucks. They've had some tests and things like that, but it's really interesting to connect those two dots.
Yeah, and I think, the passenger side and the freight side are very much linked because, well, I'm sure we'll get into this more, but because of the outsized power that freight railroads have over passenger rail in this country, you can't really separate the two. But in terms of what you're talking about for zero emissions freight, there's been a lot of different attempts to implement solutions. California recently passed the Advanced Clean Fleets rule, and I think the EPA recently came out with its own version that basically sort of mandates this gradual transmission to zero emission trucks by 2048, I believe. I don't really want to get into details, but there's a lot of different types of trucks. And basically right now, they're mostly talking about battery trucks or hydrogen trucks. But these are both pretty new technologies, right? There's some prototype battery trucks out there, prototype hydrogen fuel cell trucks, but many people have concerns about the range of all these things. Another problem also is that, switching to battery trucks doesn't necessarily take away all of the impacts of trucking. In some cases, it could be worse. The air quality is a huge problem, but there's also, millions of dollars of public health damages every year from people who get killed by trucks, killed in, crashes, damage on roads. The trucks are really heavy and really wear down the roads. And that's a problem here as well. A lot of our roads, particularly in industrial areas, are in really bad condition because there's got these heavy trucks. And, battery trucks are much heavier. That problem is going to get worse, not better. It also doesn't solve traffic congestion, right? Again, just the problem of having all these trucks on the road. So we've got this mandate for zero emission trucks, but I think it remains to be seen, is this going to solve all the problems? Is this going to be effective? However, there is a tried and true zero emissions freight solution that's been around for at least 100 years. And I'm talking about electric trains. You can power a train with overhead wires. It turns out it's a lot more efficient to do so. These trains also have, a lot more power, particularly for steep grades and curves. So these have been in use in the United States for over 100 years. Used to be much more widespread. The Milwaukee Railroad, which was a now extinct freight carrier in the Pacific Northwest, used these extensively and sort of promote going over mountain passes in Montana because they just have more powerful traction. And, they've also been used in some sort of more niche cases in the US for like a lot of mining trains. Like there's Deseret Railways is a coal train that's still operating in a remote part of Utah using overhead wires. Many other countries rely entirely on overhead wires. Like Switzerland has, going over these steep mountains has 100% electric network. They actually have these trains where you can like drive a truck onto a freight car and then the trucks get carried out of the train and then they can take the trucks off once they've unloaded at the end. It's kind of a cool solution for mixed distances. India has a goal of 100% electric rail by the end of the year. They've currently electrified 94% of their network, which is over 36,000 miles. So, there are a lot this is a very well-developed, very effective alternative for both trucks and for our existing diesel trains, which are also quite polluting. The Class 1 railroads, a lot of them are still running Tier 0, Tier 1 trains. These are different EPA designations for how polluting the engines are that are decades old, and that's still a huge percentage of the freight fleet as well. So these diesel freight trains are also contributing to the air quality as well.
Yeah. The India point is really interesting. I mean, they did like 45% of the network in just 5 years. And so it's not like it's something that can't be done. And they have a lot of railway lines, right? The British Empire built a lot of railways when they were there, and they're connected a lot of places, and there's a lot of trackage. And so, 45% is not a small number in that context, right? Yeah. And so, like you said, they're at 94% electrification. They'll get to 100% soon. And this is compared to like the US, which has 1%, right? 1% of the trackage.
Yeah.
And even in the EU, they're behind India. They're at 56%. Obviously, there's probably a lot of Eastern European countries and others who haven't gone that direction yet, but they'll likely get there. So I think that's interesting from that international perspective, but also the history, like you said, the Milwaukee Road. I remember being at the old station, which is now a hotel in Minneapolis, and they have this whole exhibit for the Milwaukee Road. I guess is where it kicked off from. And so it was really fascinating to see like, oh, they only had to use 2 engines versus 6 to get over the hills, and the numbers of packages they could deliver and, freight they could haul and that type of stuff. And so there is examples in the United States, but you mentioned the freight railroads. Why are the freight railroads so against this proposal or idea to electrify?
They'll throw out these supposed technical reasons why they can't do it, sort of scaremonger about putting double stack intermodal containers under wires, even though they run that in India, they do it in the East Coast. But I think the real reason is just that these companies have kind of this Wall Street short-termist mindset. I think there could be a lot of benefits from a business perspective for freight carriers were they to electrify, like you were talking about. You can use fewer engines. Maintenance costs are also lower on electric engines compared to diesel engines because there's fewer moving parts. They could potentially even move trains faster, haul more goods that way. But I think that a lot of these companies have this very short-term Wall Street mindset where they would rather, whatever profits they have, they'd rather pay those out to shareholders than to reinvest it in the business. And I think the overhead capital cost for all of these electrifying the entire rail network is really what scares them. But I think that can be overcome. I think realistically, they're probably not going to have to pay for all of it themselves. There's already existing, federal money for zero emissions locomotives. And I think if we were able to subsidize some of the cost of putting up wires, then I think that's both politically feasible and probably necessary, because there really is a lot of, public health benefits from this and benefits for passenger rail as well, were they to do this. So I think those kind of objections about the cost can be overcome. But I think it's really this kind of Wall Street mindset of wanting to invest as little as possible, which we've seen in other areas as well. After, some high profile train derailments, there's been a lot of discussion about safety and are the railroads investing enough? And I think we see across the board, they're just it's a capital intensive industry and they're going to do the minimum that they can.
How much does it cost to do like a mile of electrification on a single track freight line?
Single track, yeah, that's a complicated question. Depends who you ask. I don't have as much numbers on how it would be for private freight. I do know estimates for public, if we were able to implement various cost-saving reforms, which maybe we can get into in a bit, were we able to implement that, based on studies from Denmark and some European countries that have done recent studies, we could get down to, I think, about $2 to $4 million per mile. I think, given that these are private companies, who can have in some ways fewer restrictions, fewer obligations than public entities, I think they could easily do that, meet those costs, or maybe even a little less.
Yeah, it feels like there would be some sort of, purchasing power that, if you're going to build a ton of these lines, you can get some economies of scale and try to, get it even down to $1 million a mile, maybe.
Yeah, that's exactly it.
Yeah. And I know it sounds like a lot of money, but, from an investment standpoint over a long term, it might not actually be that much.
Yeah.
So let's hop over kind of like what's happening in California. At the state, you have two different kind of discussions going on. You have the CEQA exemption, and the other is this push for hydrogen trains. I'm curious what that CEQA exemption means and what that means for maybe like electrifying commuter railroads.
Yeah, so California Electric Rail, together with Streets for All and RailPack, two of our partner organizations, are sponsoring a bill this year, AB 2503, which is working its way through the state legislature that would provide a sort of limited, targeted exemption for environmental rail for overhead wires and, infrastructure associated with electrification and increasing passenger service. So this would be basically saying that if you are a public agency who wants to electrify your passenger rail, and if you're trying to do this on railroad tracks that exist already or a highway also works. Basically, if you have existing right of way, if you do, a little bit of public outreach, don't totally blindside the community, you do not have to go through the whole CEQA process. And this was kind of developed in response to some issues that happened with Caltrain. So first of all, for those not familiar with CEQA, that's the California Environmental Quality Act, mandates that more or less whenever you build something, the scope of the law has really expanded a lot since it was initially passed. You need to write a report analyzing the potential environmental impacts of it and recommend alternatives. But CEQA doesn't actually stop bad projects from going through. What it does is it basically provides community groups, people in the area, anybody to sue if they think the report was not done well enough. So we've seen some issues where the environmental review process itself doesn't actually stop projects going through, but it does open things up to lawsuits. And so that happened with Caltrain about 10 years ago. So Caltrain, which is the commuter rail, goes from San Francisco to San Jose, or I guess I should say regional rail. They have been undergoing electrification for the last about 10 years. They actually just finished all of the infrastructure for it this week, which is a really exciting milestone. They're set to open up this fall, start running service on it. And this was, this is a long-term plan they had. It does a lot to improve passenger service, but it's also being done to facilitate California high-speed rail, which runs on overhead wires and is going to eventually run from San Jose to San Francisco on Caltrain right of way. So this is a really great project for a lot of reasons. So we've got the new schedules available now, and they're going to have 15-minute service. They're going to have 15-minute peak service, 30-minute weekend service that cuts the travel time from San Jose to San Francisco by 25%. It shaves 25 minutes off it. It's now going to be a local trip, not an express trip. It's basically going to be time competitive with driving. So the environmental benefits of this are huge. It has the potential to, not only are you getting rid of the emissions from the diesel locomotives that used to run on Caltrain, you also have this potential for mode shift, where you're moving travel from cars onto the train because it's now more convenient to take the train. And these improvements are made possible by electrification because electric motors can accelerate faster, so you have less time going in and out of stops. This hasn't happened yet, but with some track upgrades that will eventually happen, trains also will be able to go faster too. And so all of those benefits have this really strong potential for mode shift and reducing emissions from cars that way. So this is a project that was obviously beneficial for the environment, right? But despite that, the city of Atherton, as well as the city of San Mateo, filed a CEQA lawsuit on, I think, pretty bogus grounds that ended up delaying the project for about 3 years. What were they suing over? What were their actual objections? So one of the objections from San Mateo is they wanted Caltrain to pay for grade separations and do all of that for the city. In general, grade separations, that's basically putting a tunnel or bridge or something so that the traffic doesn't have to stop when the train goes by. Cities are responsible for this, not transit agencies. Generally, they can do this whenever they want, but they were just kind of trying to extort these concessions from Caltrain. Atherton's complaints were about the visual impact of having to look at wires and the removal of like a small number of trees along the side of the rail line. Atherton is extremely affluent community. I think the average income is like $200,000 or something like that. It's a very wealthy enclave who are concerned about having to look at wires. And so they filed this lawsuit, which CEQA empowers them to do. As you can imagine, the grounds they're filing on this are pretty dubious. And so the case was thrown out, but all of the uncertainty over the lawsuit basically emboldened Republicans in Congress to try to withhold the federal funding for the project. This pushed the project into the Trump administration, which is now emboldened to withhold these funds. There's a massive lobbying campaign to, get the Republican Secretary of Transportation to release these funds and to allow construction to begin. So led to a sort of cascade of delays that pushed the timeline back 3 years, which increased with inflation, and all of that ballooned the project cost. So, that's 3 extra years of more cars on the road, slower train service, and also, millions of extra dollars for taxpayers because of this lawsuit. So the idea behind this legislation would be to remove that lawsuit risk for other projects and make it faster and cheaper for public agencies to move forward with electrification.
So who would be targeted to then use this legislation? I mean, now it's opened up, you can build electric trains on railroads, rights of way that exist, highways, streets, etc. I'm curious, who would be a target for the first implementation of this or the first use of this?
Yeah, so our top target would be Metrolink, which is the regional rail agency in Southern California. It's the main transit connection between the Inland Empire and Los Angeles and Orange County. Southern California mega region has this sort of massive commute shed. Where I live in the Inland Empire, there's a lot of people who are like teachers or construction workers or cops or whatever who in LA who live out here and have like a 60-mile car commute. And, having better transit options would be really helpful for that from an air quality perspective, quality of life perspective. But Metrolink right now is really slow, doesn't have as frequent service as we would like. It's not a great option for many people. And the Metrolink San Bernardino line, which goes from San Bernardino to Los Angeles, is entirely owned by public agencies. It's existing right of way. Would they wish to electrify it, they could use this exemption and cut back on a lot of the lawsuit risk and paperwork. Similarly, the Antelope Valley line, which goes from LA to Palmdale via Burbank and Santa Clarita, it's also another target. So that is also publicly owned. Both of these are very high frequency lines. So the fiscal case for doing this and increasing the frequency is very high. San Bernardino line is Metrolink's highest ridership line. And it together with the Antelope Valley line have kind of the best, most frequent service in the whole Metrolink system. So both of these we think would definitely be able to use this exemption and sort of top targets for it.
How much would this speed up the travel times too? I'm curious about that because like you said, Caltrain is looking to, increase the travel times 25%. Is it 25 minutes or 25%?
It's both. It was formerly 100 minutes. Now it'll be 75. So.
Okay, gotcha. So basically an hour, 40 minutes, and it's cut down 25 minutes, which is a fair amount of time. So I'm wondering if the Antelope Valley line, the San Bernardino line, those are pretty distant places from LA and the destinations that people would want to go. So there's probably some benefits to that travel time decreasing.
Yeah, definitely. So the San Bernardino line I think it's about 5 miles longer than Caltrain, but, it's pretty comparable. And it has fewer stops than Caltrain does, even on a, full service, all stops trip. But nevertheless, I think the San Bernardino line is about an hour and 40 minutes, hour and 50 minutes. And so it's substantially slower than Caltrain on the new schedules, despite having fewer stops. So I think if we could probably see similar improvements on that, which would be put it in, ballpark, same time as Caltrain. So if we had a 75, 80-minute trip for that, hour and 20 minutes, now we're competitive with driving, right? So that would be huge. The Antelope Valley line is a bit more complicated on the speeds because it has a lot of curves. I would need to look into exactly what are the capabilities on those in more detail, but, San Bernardino line's straight shot, pretty comparable to Caltrain, so I think we could see similar improvements there.
It would probably also benefit the connection between Sacramento and the Bay Area. For one, the SMART line that goes up north to Santa Rosa, those would definitely benefit from electrification as well, especially if you build for the Sacramento line, especially if you build the second Transbay tube and allow it to, have access to the high-speed rail or the Caltrain extension. So that would be a possible, use of that as well.
Yeah, that's a great point. So Capital Corridor, which runs from San Jose to Sacramento, actually stops right next to the electric trains and Diridon Station. Is another really promising target for this. That's a bit longer segment, but yeah, and as you were alluding to, there's this Link 21 process that's trying to plan for transit improvements for the Northern California mega region, who are currently studying options for a second Transbay tube. And the two options they're considering are basically BART gauge, like putting more BART lines in the tunnel, and standard gauge rail, which would be something like Caltrain. So if we're going to go with the standard gauge rail option, you could have Caltrain continuing from San Francisco up into the East Bay, where it's then going to be connecting up with Capital Corridor, right? So it really makes sense to have all of these lines, which are already connected, using the same type of infrastructure, the same tracks, the same power system, overhead wires. Capital Corridor is going to be a little bit more challenging because most of the tracks are owned by Union Pacific, which of all the Class 1 railroads is the most hostile to passenger rail increases. But I mean, I think it's a fight worth doing. And I think we need more leadership from our electeds to tell them to, eat rocks or kick rocks or whatever.
Kick rocks. Yeah. I mean, we discussed a little bit of this earlier, but I think the BNSF and UP are, those are two Class 1 railroads that tend to have a hard time letting passenger rail on their tracks. Is there a specific reason why they're so hostile?
So it depends. I mean, so I think BNSF is generally much less hostile than Union Pacific is. So actually, one thing that's really exciting is that California high-speed rail, there's plans for that. A lot of the planning, environmental work for the Southern California portion is sort of actively happening right now. And so for the between Burbank and Anaheim, the California high-speed rail is going to be sharing tracks with Metrolink, which is another reason why we really want to electrify Metrolink. We could make that process happen so much faster. And, the transit agencies are not going to have to pay for the environmental review for that because it's already being done. But anyway, a lot between LA and Anaheim, those tracks are owned by BNSF. So BNSF has agreed in the planning documents that we're seeing coming out, they have agreed to allow overhead wires on the right of way that they own, which is, kind of the first time they've done that in California. And this is a really exciting precedent for future transit projects on their right of way. Why are they so hostile to passengers? I think it's just competition for space, right? They want to run as many freight trains as possible. They don't want to have to give up time slots to passengers because it's competition, basically. And that's been a real plaguing rail in the United States since the 60s, when Amtrak was created and basically split off passenger and freight rail. Basically, the freight rail gets the most profitable part, and they have no incentive to do anything for passenger rail since they're now their competitors. So that's one of the underlying structural reasons why, Amtrak service sucks in a lot of places, why we don't have better intercity rail, just as a whole.
Yeah, we had Ken Prendergast on a couple of weeks ago to talk about that and what's going on in Ohio with intercity rail and the kind of the competition between Amtrak and Brightline that's going on up there. And the interesting part of that is that, Amtrak basically pays for the impact of the individual train on that individual track versus market rates, which would be much higher. If they paid market rates, I'm sure UP or whoever else would love to host them, but they're not going to do that. So that's one of the things that's the issue. I also saw recently some pushback from the railroads complaining about CARB to EPA, which CARB is requiring the diesel locomotive phase out. And so there's a lot of kind of saber rattling around that as well.
Yeah, so California is, last year passed this regulation called the in-use locomotive rule, which basically mandates that all newly purchased locomotives operating in the state by 2045 be operated in zero emissions mode. And also has this timeline where you basically can't run engines that are older than 20 years, which basically is this mandated phase out of diesel locomotives by 2045 or so. So that's kind of the basic aspect of the legislation. A lot of environmental groups have been championing on it, a lot of energy on zero emissions rail right now in the environmental world. But yeah, the Class 1s have been lobbying really hard against it. They don't want to invest in new technology. They want to keep running the same ancient diesel trains until they fall apart, basically. So they've, been lobbying against this very heavily. They've also filed a lawsuit. The American Association of Railroads did, challenging the California's legal authority to do this, basically saying it's violating the Commerce Clause because, rail lines cross state lines. So currently the EPA is considering granting California a waiver that would allow them to continue to make this rule. And I believe they're also in the early stages of considering their own ruling, which would presumably be somewhat laxer. That's usually how things go. But yeah, I think this rule has been kind of divisive sort of in the rail community, because I think it is essential. We're going to need some sort of regulatory action to force the Class 1 railroads to electrify, since they seem very reluctant to do so on their own. At the same time, this rule does not actually mandate electrification. It just mandates zero emissions, which could also include battery trains, could also include hydrogen trains, which really are not a serious technology. And a lot of us are concerned that this is going to increase the push for hydrogen trains in California, and also just lead to failed implementation of this rule, because, the Class 1 railroads, when they talk about this, they like to pretend that catenary doesn't exist, that they don't even mention it or just say it's impossible, because I think they know that it's the only viable option for freight. All of the battery and hydrogen trains are really only in the prototype stage. They're not used widely for freight anywhere in the world. And so I think there's a concern that with this ruling as well, they're just going to, invest in some hydrogen pilots. They're going to test it and say, oh, no, it doesn't work. Sorry, we can't comply with the rule. Give us a 10-year extension. And that's 10 years wasted where frontline communities are continuing to breathe dirty air. And that's sort of a critical window for action on climate change. We need to reduce vehicle miles traveled by 25% by 2030. We need to radically wind down emissions in the next decade as well if we're going to meet climate goals. And so that's kind of a concern, I and other people in the rail world have about this rule.
It's an interesting fork in the road because, the freight railroads and others could go down this hydrogen track instead of the electrification track. And I still don't understand. I've said this many times. And as, my namesake, the overhead wire suggests, I'm in the tank kind of for overhead wires. But at the same time, why would you want to carry around all your power with you when you don't have to? That's a lot of weight. That's a lot of energy just on, transporting the energy to transport the energy kind of thing, right? So that's frustrating too. But I feel like this fork in the road is interesting to me because you can go towards electrification with catenaries and overhead wires, or you could go down this battery/hydrogen road. And it seems like the hydrogen discussion is getting some traction, at least at the state level.
Yeah, there's a lot of energy going into hydrogen right now that's coming largely from the governor's office and from executive offices in California. And I think the underlying reason for this is the Inflation Reduction Act has created massive subsidies for hydrogen. And there's this whole sort of hydrogen hub program, or these federally funded public-private partnerships that are sort of vying for these IRA funds to basically massively scale up hydrogen production. The one in California is called ARCHES. And so there's a lot of money and lobbying going into this right now. And a lot of, I think, really misguided policy coming from the governor's office. So there's all of this federal funding, right? There's also a lot of lobbying from fossil fuel interests right now. So the idea behind this is there's two main ways to make hydrogen. One is that you split water, you take the hydrogen atoms off of water molecule using electricity. That's usually called green hydrogen, although people disagree about those definitions. The other way is this process called steam methane reformation, where you basically take the hydrogen off of natural gas. And that's where the overwhelming majority of natural gas comes from today. And so there's been a lot of lobbying by fossil fuel interests. They've been investing a lot in hydrogen, doing a lot of active lobbying in order to promote hydrogen, because they see hydrogen as basically their salvation as, we wind down the use of fossil fuels. So for example, Sempra, which is the umbrella organization that owns SoCal Gas, donated $250,000 last year to California politicians. They're one of the top donors in the state. Chevron spent $1.2 million lobbying. These companies are consistently the top donors and some of the top corporate money going into our state house, mostly targeting moderate Democrats, basically. Back to the statewide policy that's promoting hydrogen. So we've seen this in a lot of different offices. We've seen it actually in CARB, which passed this in-use locomotive rule, which is technology neutral. But a lot of their messaging is just completely ignorant about electric trains. They put out this public-facing zero-emissions rail dashboard that has maybe only 50 zero-emissions rail projects in total. A third of them are hydrogen. All of the electric rail projects are brand new, making it look like overhead wires are this new experimental technology that's like basically the same as hydrogen, when in fact there are, probably tens of thousands of electric locomotives used all around the world. It's the backbone of these many countries' rail systems, whereas all the hydrogen rail are in fact new pilots. And this is a public facing document. And, a lot of their internal documents are similarly biased against overhead wires. In terms of other offices, the California's Office of Business has been actively lobbying for weaker regulations on what counts as green hydrogen. And another concern with hydrogen is even if you're not making from natural gas directly, if you're using electricity, if that electricity isn't new renewables, if it's not carefully matched in kind of time and space to the hydrogen production, then you're just kind of potentially sucking renewable energy out of the grid and just increasing demand for electricity and creating more demand for natural gas. So, the governor's office has been actively lobbying against those restrictions, which is kind of the same thing that fossil fuel companies have been lobbying for. The last thing, which is maybe the most egregious, is Caltrans has ordered a bunch of hydrogen trains to be used on basically what are formerly known as Amtrak California routes. So that's the Surfliner, that's Capital Corridor, that's San Joaquin's. They spent $127 million for 8 of these that they bought from Stadler. This is just significantly higher costs per train than, battery or catenary alternatives, and have made these purchases without having these ever operate anywhere in real world use in the United States. So they're pouring a lot of money into this completely untested hydrogen technology, which could be run on, really important rail lines like the Surfliner, which connects the 2 biggest cities in the state, right? The Surfliner goes from LA to San Diego. Capital Corridor connects Oakland to Sacramento. Right? These are really important rail lines.
So what is the biggest issue with hydrogen trains?
So there's issues from kind of environmental perspective, and then there's also issues from, I think, a performance, reliability, and cost aspect, which I think are really overlooked, but really quite vital. Most of the hydrogen on the market today comes from fossil fuels. The CO2 emissions are almost the same as diesel. They are cleaner from an air quality perspective, but it's certainly not zero emissions like many people claim. Even if you're using green hydrogen made from electricity, it's at least 3 times less efficient than just powering it with overhead wires. You're using 3 times more energy for the same thing, which is going to be more expensive and, it's just wasteful, right? Especially when we're concerned about grid reliability and, do we have the grid capacity to electrify things? You want to be as efficient as possible. Now, from the transit rider perspective, hydrogen trains are a very new technology, right? They've never been used in North America in an operational sense outside of a testing facility. There's been some fairly widespread adoption of hydrogen trains in Germany, primarily for these rural low-frequency rail lines, which is what they're generally considered to be best for. It's like if you have a rail line that it's like so low frequency that it's not cost effective to put up the wires, and you have like a long distance, so you can't use battery, that's when they're looking at hydrogen, right? That is incidentally not the application that they're being proposed for in California. Those type of trains don't really exist that much because we have just so much less rail. These are being proposed for like high frequency, main line, regional rail, intercity rail rights. That's not what their hydrogen is appropriate for. But even in these kind of niche uses where they've been used in Germany, they've seen a lot of problems. Some of this can be blamed on Alstom, which has had a lot of reliability issues with many of their trains. But state of Baden-Württemberg in Germany, a bunch of studies found that hydrogen trains are 80% more expensive than battery electric trains to operate. In the Frankfurt area there, they had sort of widespread service disruptions after there was issues with the electrolyzer. And another location in Germany as well, where they just tried hydrogen trains, found they were too expensive, and are discontinuing them after only a few years in operation. So the track record for these hydrogen trains are not good. Another thing about hydrogen trains is they don't have any of the technical benefits of electrification, at least as far as we know, right? It's possible, with the technology improves over time, maybe they could get there, but that's currently unknown. Electric trains can accelerate faster. They can also do up to 125 miles per hour on sort of conventional intercity rail trains, right? Hydrogen trains have not really been approved in the United States for speeds higher than 79 miles an hour. We don't really know what their top speeds are, but they're probably going to be worse because, as you said, you have to carry around all their fuel, right? And in general, hydrogen trains are most cost effective at low service frequencies, less than 1 train per hour, whereas electric trains are most cost effective at every 50 minutes. If you're running hydrogen trains, there's an incentive to not run more trains, to not run more service, because it's going to increase costs. With electric trains, it's actually most cost effective to run a lot of trains because then you get more revenue to pay off the cost of the infrastructure. So the real concern we have is that by investing in hydrogen trains on these really vital routes like the Capital Corridor, like the Surfliner, we're locking in low service for potentially decades. And part of the reason for that also is like hydrogen trains are being chosen to avoid a political fight with the class ones over allowing more passenger service, which is, I think, a fight we need to have if we want to improve transit, reduce driving, meet our climate goals.
So what kind of traction are you getting at the state level from the organization and kind of pushing against some of this silliness?
Well, I think there's a lot more work to do in terms of the governor's office. I think Caltrans, pretty intransigent for a lot of reasons. Beyond the hydrogen stuff, they're also still really very devoted to widening highways. A lot of transit advocates are not happy with them for a number of reasons. In terms of other stuff, like our CEQA exemption bill is doing very well. It passed the Assembly 73-0, no opposition. It has already passed its first committee in the Senate, where we still have one more committee to go as of this recording. And so I'm feeling pretty good about that legislation. I think we have a lot more work to do in terms of nice to have like a rail caucus within the state legislature that is going to push for good rail policy. We do have some relationships with a few elected officials, but I think we've still got a lot more work to do as far as the governor goes.
I know you're focused on railroad electrification and transit and trains on freight right-of-ways and things like that, but I'm wondering if there's like any lessons for other types of electrification. Like, we've seen this move towards battery electric buses when we know that there's, trolley buses are a thing and they've existed for decades and 100 years almost, or more actually, I should say. But are there any lessons from your advocacy for the zero emissions transit movement?
I mean, I think a lot of the energy going into hydrogen is also affecting buses, right? There's going to be a lot of money for hydrogen and a lot of push to adopt hydrogen buses. And I think there's potential issues with there as well. For example, Sunline Transit, which is in like Palm Springs area, is running hydrogen buses. They had a lot of issues with the hydrogen fueling that actually led to them having to run 20% less service last year because so many of their buses couldn't be fueled properly. They're having to loan out buses from other agencies. And there's also a hydrogen bus that exploded in refueling in Bakersfield. So I think, there's similar potential reliability issues as far as that goes. I definitely support trolley buses. I think they're a no-brainer. It's really heartening to see that San Francisco has kind of changed course on their trying to get rid of some of their trolley buses, and now they've changed course on that, which is really good. Yeah, and I think there's some similar issues with trolley buses as there is to electric rail. So it's my understanding that SB 922, which was a bill passed a few years ago that streamlines a lot of transit infrastructure, although notably not heavy rail, that provides an exemption for trolley bus infrastructure already. But I think a lot of policymakers just are allergic to infrastructure investment. They're allergic to putting up the wires, worried about political blowback or high upfront costs or something. And I think they need to sort of get over that, and we need pushing them on that, with electric rail could be applicable for trolley buses as well.
The NIMBYism is a big issue. I mean, that was a thing when I was trying to get electric transit in Austin. In Austin, you have the Capitol View corridors, which are quote unquote sacrosanct. You're not supposed to put anything visually that might interrupt the view of the Capitol in Austin, Texas, for example. In DC, they have some similar rules where that you can't have, any wires or anything overhead that might mess up the visual aesthetic of the city. And so, for the 8th Street line, they could build wires outside of this segment of the city, but you couldn't build it inside. And so a lot of that comes from NIMBYism and opposition. And, one of my favorite sayings is, my lungs don't care about your visual aesthetic, but it tends to be something that people glom onto. If there's something that people can grab onto that they can oppose, the wires tend to be one of those things.
Yeah. Yeah, so some of this CEQA streamlining stuff that we've done does kind of help with that in a narrow sense. But I think there's it at least takes away people's ability to sue and cause lots of rack up costs, but there's still, the sort of just general project opposition is still going to be a problem. I mean, transit agencies, they're often very kind of deferential to these very small and privileged groups of people that get really up in arms about visual impacts. I think, part of it, I think, is just we need to change the culture. And I think, younger environmentalists kind of get this, where it's, it's not about how stuff looks. It's about, the underlying processes and how that affects people. I think also, one thing that can help is governance reform. That's kind of a problem in Southern California, particularly where rail agencies are all run by these kind of local DOTs, local Department of Transit, who, to begin with, their focus is mostly highways. They mostly see themselves as their job is to build highways, and transit is kind of a side thing that they're not very willing to put a lot of money or time or political capital into. And just because of their organization, they're also very beholden to local interests. Like, for example, Metrolink put this new rail line, the Redlands Arrow, goes from San Bernardino to Redlands. We're considering overhead wires early in the process, but, there's opposition from Redlands, which is much smaller, much whiter, much more affluent than San Bernardino or much of the surrounding area, but people sort of raised a stink, and so the agency just kind of abandoned wires from consideration. I think just changing the political structure so that, these very small groups of people are not, this deciding factor in these decisions is also important. So that's why California Electric Rail has advocated for consolidation of all of these rail agencies in Southern California under a single operator that manages the capital and runs these projects. And that also creates the opportunity for economies of scale and, just better management of these projects, which is also another issue that we've seen as well, of just like these agencies not being able to work with each other across county lines, even though the train crosses county lines.
Yeah. What's been the most interesting thing about this overall discussion about electrification in California?
I'm surprised how much it's taken off. Like, it feels like a very nerdy kind of niche thing in some ways, but I feel like I've gotten a lot of engagement on social media, a lot of people offline who like see the stuff on social media and are really excited about it. And there's just like a lot of momentum. I think there's a lot of appetite for better transit, appetite for clean air. How do we get there is really unclear. And people are excited to see solutions.
Yeah. Well, where can folks find out more about what you're doing and help out if they can?
So you can go to our website at calelectricrail.org or follow us on Twitter or Blue Sky at Cal Electric Rail. Yeah, we've got a lot of great information there, educational information. And our website also has a link. You can sign up for our list house if you want to get emails about actions we're doing. In addition to our statewide stuff, we also engage with different, transit agencies, regulatory agencies, trying to send people out to give public comment for different meetings and things like that. And so if you are excited about this and want to volunteer, sign up for our email list so we can have opportunities for you.
Awesome. Well, Adrianna, thanks so much for joining us. We really appreciate your time.
Yeah, thank you so much. Great talking with you, Jeff.
Thanks for joining us. The Talking Headways podcast is a project of The Overhead Wire and appears first at Streetsblog USA. Thanks to our generous Patreon supporters for supporting this show and Mondays at The Overhead Wire. You can support the show by going to patreon.com/TheOverheadWire. Sign up for our 18-year-old daily newsletter by visiting TheOverheadWire.com or check the show notes for other cool merch and opportunities to connect. Follow along using your podcatcher of choice, but if you can't find it there, you can always find the show at its original home, usa.streetsblog.org. We'll see you next time at Talking Headways.